crítico.
Tall tales, legends, myths. Hello, I'm William B. Davis. In this hour of the Critical Eye, we bring fresh scrutiny to controversies debated the world over. We'll look at the creation story of Noah's Ark, the epic but elusive Loch Ness Monster, and the lost continent of Atlantis. But first, we examine tall tales of the man-beast said to roam the deep woods. Is Bigfoot really out there? Or is this creature merely a figment of the collective imagination?
Diz a lenda que Pé Grande é metade humano, metade animal. Talvez sobrevivente de uma tribo perdida, ou civilização extinta. Seja qual for a explicação, as descrições da criatura são incrivelmente semelhantes.
Bigfoot is a creature that is 6.5 feet to 8 feet tall, man-like, covered in hair. It has a foot that looks like a human foot, but it's anywhere from 14 to 18 inches long.
If Bigfoot is in fact a creature, it's a primate that walks on 2 feet, then it is the only primate other than man that is truly bipedal. That means that it is a closer relative than the chimpanzee. And yet it has no tool-making abilities, it has no language, it has no culture. All of these things make it a very improbable creature and also unsuitable for the Pacific Northwest environment.
O criptozoologista Loren Coleman segue o rastro do Pé Grande pela América do Norte há mais de 3 décadas.
There's various theories about what Bigfoot is, of course, and one of the major theories is that it's in essence, a species of hominid that really has survived in a relic state, probably migrated over from China, from the Asian area, across the Bering Straits, on down into the Pacific Northwest.
The evidence that we have for Gigantopithecus is very, very scanty. It's a few molars found in a cave in China. We don't really know what the creature looked like. We know almost nothing about this creature. And to presuppose that it migrated to the Pacific Northwest, I think, the data is not there to support such a proposition.
We know from Native American legends, Native Canadian legends, that there were creatures around called, variously translated as hairy giants.
Desses contos folclóricos surgiu a lenda do Pé Grande ou Sasquatch.
A lot of people like to believe that there's this sort of pure, untouched creature that's out running free and wild that nobody can explain. And I think for a lot of people that's comforting. And I think that's part of the reason that the Bigfoot myth has endured.
Durante gerações, a repetição criou personagem exuberante. Mas seria ele exato ou uma fantasia coletiva?
We find a Bigfoot-type creature almost in all the corners of the world. In Florida, it's called the skunk ape. In the Pacific Northwest and in the East Coast, it's called Bigfoot. In China, it's called the wild man. In the Himalayas, it's called the Yeti.
Michael Dennett passou 20 anos seguindo a lenda e suas origens. Ele acha que a variedade de relatos semelhantes pelo mundo só pode levar a uma conclusão.
The evidence would suggest that there is not a physical creature. The only creature that actually inhabits all the continents is man himself. For an animal to have such distribution is highly improbable.
One of the startling revelations in modern anthropology is that we did not exist alone. Upwards of 1.5 million years ago, for instance, in Africa, there were 6 or 7 separate species of humanoids. It doesn't go for much of a stretch of imagination to think that in parallel with humans, but a little bit further back into the wilderness, these creatures have existed.
Além da possibilidade antropológica, Loren Coleman afirma que as evidências científicas mostram que o pé grande é real e que vive entre nós.
First of all, you have forensic evidence, footprints that are actually showing dermal ridges. So you're having fingerprint experts saying, this is a unique species. This is something that people can't fake. Thousands of miles of footprints if you put them end to end. You have hair samples, which also come back inconclusive. Why did they come back inconclusive? Because we don't have a type species of Bigfoot yet. You have a whole body of modern sightings from some very credible people, police officers, priests, Boy Scout camp leaders, and housewives.
Outros dizem que um simples argumento desmente esses relatos. Se uma espécie de pés grandes tivesse habitado a América do Norte, seria necessário uma grande população reprodutora.
In order for there to be a sustained population, there would have to be between, the estimates are around 6,000 to 10,000 of them. So just think about that for a second. We're talking 6,000 to 10,000 Bigfoot in America. There's thousands of them, if one is to be believed, and you simply don't come across thousands of Bigfoot everywhere. There aren't that many tracks, there aren't that many sightings, they're not there.
Um filme convincente se destaca na discussão do pé grande. Outubro de 1967, Bluff Creek, no norte da Califórnia. Percorrendo a floresta a cavalo, Roger Patterson e Bob Gimlin encontraram uma criatura estranha.
They were just supposedly filming footage for a documentary. Background footage of sandbars, of trees, different things like that. That's why they had the camera along. They come around a bend, the horse gets spooked. Roger gets down off the horse and starts filming this incredible footage of what is a Bigfoot.
Depois de examinar o filme de Patterson e Gimlin, Loren Coleman chegou a várias conclusões sobre a criatura da imagem.
The creature in the Patterson film is about 6.5 feet tall, but it also has the bulk and the weight of something much more than any human. If you look closely at this film, you'll notice that the knees do not lock. The actual shoulders on an ape are higher than the head. And so when an ape looks at something, it moves its whole body like this. When a human looks, we move our neck.
The height of the creature could not be substantiated above that of a normal human, that the motion, the fluidity of the motion was well within the capabilities of a human form. It looks to me like a man in a fur suit.
Peter Byrne, que se intitula Caçador do Pé Grande, passou a vida seguindo a besta lendária pelo noroeste do Pacífico. Ele acredita estar à beira de uma grande descoberta. Mas Byrne adverte que será difícil de achar um tipo de prova mais definitiva.
We still don't have physical evidence, and that's what science demands. There's a reason, of course. People ask me, they say, why hasn't a body been found? Well, the reason for that is fairly simple, that in the Northwest, just like in Asia and in Africa, when something dies, it's eaten by other animals. Here we're looking for something which is obviously shy, very elusive, very wary, very conscious of man as an enemy, possibly nocturnal, moving all the time.
This would be valid if the reports that we have of Bigfoot only came from people penetrating into these isolated areas. But in fact, most of our reports from Bigfoot are in populated rural areas, and we do have numerous reports from suburban areas and even some urban area reports. Bigfoot essentially is really a creature of the inhabited areas of the state, not the uninhabited areas.
Durante 4 décadas, Peter Byrne conduziu grandes expedições com o objetivo de achar o pé grande. Ele usou tecnologia de ponta, técnicas e métodos analíticos.
We used ground sensors, motion sensor cameras, 2 helicopters, one of which had a FLIR, which is a forward-looking infrared unit, and they were on standby. So that if ever we got a sighting, and we got to the sighting quickly enough, we bring the helicopters in, try and get close to whatever was there, use the FLIR to track it, and try and get in on it with video cameras.
Esta tecnologia ainda não forneceu uma imagem do pé grande. Por isso, Byrne continua seguindo a fera a pé.
Now, this is interesting because this is an overhang in the bank, and it's a place where wild animals would take shelter from cold wind, from rain, and where a Bigfoot actually might take shelter also. So when we find a place like this, we always search it in the hope of finding some kind of evidence. In 1960, in a place very similar to this, we found a bed. The bed was 9 feet long, 4 feet wide, and about a foot thick, and made with moss. And there was an indentation of a body in the moss. The bed could only have been made by 3 things: by a fisherman, but we were 30 miles back, a long way from anywhere, and the fish in the stream were very, very small. Fishermen didn't go there. Could have been made by a hunter, but a hunter doesn't go back 30 miles to shoot a deer and then carry it out. And again, the moss in the bed, which was 12 inches thick, was pulled off 3 trees up to a height of 12 feet from the trees, higher than I could reach. And all of this added up to the fact that it was very probably a Bigfoot bed.
Sem evidências físicas, o pé grande continua sendo apenas uma lenda.
The dearth of good photographic evidence for Bigfoot is a compelling argument that Bigfoot is a creature of legend, not a creature of fact.
I believe that a well-organized and well-funded project, a few $1 million, say 5 years, it's possible we could bring one in.
There are other forms of evidence that would suggest further investigation. Credible photographs, multiple unrelated eyewitness reports. Based on the evidence that we have, there's no suggestion that this is a real creature. It conforms to exactly what we would expect from folklore.
People up in the Pacific Northwest can have a whole lifetime of hiking in the woods and never see a mountain lion. We know mountain lions exist. Why aren't people seeing them? Mountain lions avoid people just the same way that Bigfoot does. Are there mountain lions around? Yes, there are. Are there Bigfoot around? Probably.
What science would need to establish the presence of a Bigfoot would be some sort of hard evidence. We're talking a bone, a piece of flesh, a live one, a dead one, a skeleton, anything except for what they have now.
E Deus disse a Noé: darei fim a todos os seres humanos. Você fará uma arca de madeira de cipreste, faça entrar na arca um casal de cada dos seres vivos.
In the Bible, the world soon after creation had developed into such a wicked place that God had to destroy it all. And so he sent the flood as a judgment of this sinful, wicked world. But Noah's Ark was the means by which the believers in that previous civilization escaped that judgment and were placed in a new and better world afterwards.
No relato do Antigo Testamento, Noé construiu uma arca de 137 metros de comprimento e 22 metros de largura. Grande o bastante para caber um casal de cada criatura da terra.
Given the biblical dimensions of the ark, as described in Scripture, the ark was a huge, huge vessel, one of the largest ever built. And so the volume of the ark, we can estimate. Maybe 10 or 20,000 animals on board the ark.
Segundo especialistas da construção naval, há um limite máximo de cerca de 91 metros de comprimento de um barco de madeira. Além dessa medida que a Bíblia afirma que a arca possuía, ela teria ficado sujeita a afundar e a perder sua integridade estrutural. Peritos concordam que, sem a ajuda de um reforço de aço, um barco de madeira dessa dimensão não poderia ser viável. Segundo o relato, assim que Noé, sua família e os animais subiram a bordo da arca, uma inundação devastou a terra. Depois disso, a Bíblia nos diz que a arca foi descansar no topo do Monte Ararat. Noé e seus passageiros humanos e animais repovoaram a terra. História verdadeira? Ou, como diz os céticos, alegoria religiosa?
The story is a teaching story. It says that evil can become so rampant that the God of that particular area will become angry and will cause a flood.
This is not about a great flood. This is about redemption. It's about how it's a story to teach us that no matter how bad things get, God will find the good among us and he will save us. And that's the lesson of the story.
O Dr. John Morris, do Centro da Ciência da Criação, interpreta a história de Noé como fato. Ele acha que podemos explicar a Arca de Noé examinando o nosso passado.
What we're discovering these days as we look at archaeology and the more we learn about ancient humans is ancient man was not primitive. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that Noah and his family could have built this ark. Besides, we really don't know what pre-flood man was like. That world is totally gone. The one remaining link to that pre-flood world is the Ark of Noah.
Morris acredita na inundação de Noé, que estudiosos da Bíblia datam de 4000 a.C. As cicatrizes deixadas por esse desastre destruiriam noções consolidadas sobre a idade da Terra.
Is the Earth billions of years old, or could it be only thousands of years old? As a geologist, I find a great deal of geologic evidence that the Earth is just thousands of years old. If Noah's flood really happened, there's no evidence left to support evolution or an old Earth. So Noah's flood is the key to understanding history.
Mas através do processo de datação por radiocarbono, ficou provado que a Terra tem no mínimo 4,5 bilhões de anos.
Science says all of the evidence that we have indicates that there is no great catastrophe that struck the Earth 5,000 years ago that wiped out all plant and animal life. Period. That's what we can show.
O arqueólogo Ken Feder vê falhas em qualquer teoria de um episódio cataclísmico que não deixe uma prova física.
Imagine a nuclear war right now, destroying everybody on the planet except for a handful of people. And that those handful of people and the few animals they're able to save in their fallout shelter, they come out after the radiation dies down and see that everything has been destroyed. The evidence of that catastrophe would be there in the stratigraphic record of archaeological analysis. The fact that there is no such thing for Noah is a pretty good indication that there was no worldwide flood.
Embora não exista nenhuma evidência geológica ou arqueológica de inundação global, nem de morte em massa há 4.000 anos, os criacionistas não se abalam. Eles acreditam que a prova da existência de Noé pode estar no topo da montanha vulcânica na Turquia, conhecida pelo nome de Ararat. Foi ali que Noé teria desembarcado e onde o investigador John McIntosh espera achar a arca há muito perdida.
As we've researched Mount Ararat, we are down to a handful of locations that we think are the most likely locations for something to have been preserved. There are some ice cap locations where we think a part of a structure could still be under the ice and in a fault. There's good indication that it's been broken into several pieces. We think there could be an upper part buried and then the lower part down into the gorge.
Em pesquisas de campo na Turquia, McIntosh registrou declarações de testemunhas de que os restos da Arca de Noé estão no topo do Monte Ararat.
From the accounts of people that say they have seen a structure on the mountain, they say it's rock hard, it's petrified. Mount Ararat is a volcano. And so if you wanted to preserve a wood structure, one of the better places to do it would be on a volcano that would bury it under volcanic ash.
So when the wood is brought down from Mount Ararat, every piece that's been tested by carbon-14 dating has been from the 6th to the 13th century. Nothing earlier than that. And that's of our era. This is not BC.
Os cientistas rebatem as declarações das testemunhas e a noção de que uma estrutura em madeira de 5.000 anos sobreviveria no Planalto.
With the landslides, the snow slides, and the ice slides that they have there, the crevices opening and crumbling, the possibility becomes more and more rare.
O Dr. John Morris vem conduzindo as próprias expedições em busca da Arca nos últimos 30 anos. Ele afirma que a busca seria mais fácil se essa região da Turquia não fosse tão instável.
The people that live on Mount Ararat are Kurdish people, the kind of people that are in rebellion even now against Saddam Hussein in northern Iraq. It's a very sensitive military zone. They're not against us looking so much, but they are against us causing problems and the potential for an international incident.
Archaeology is taking place all over in Turkey. If there was anything really there that the Turkish government thought would be worthwhile, they would, of course, endorse it. It'd make a wonderful place for visitors to go to and bring money into the country.
We've been hindered from really completing the research. We've only been able to do a limited amount, and then things are shut down. If we get to check out all the valuable sites here on this mountain, we can either lay this to rest, say there's nothing here now, or if we find it, well then examine the evidence.
Atualmente, pesquisadores estão esperançosos. Imagens de alta resolução por satélite do Monte Ararat mostraram anomalias interessantes, mas não passaram de simples afloramentos. Hoje em dia, não surgiu nenhuma evidência de que a Arca de Noé tenha existido. Nem há nenhuma evidência geológica de uma grande inundação datando da época da Arca. Mas os defensores não desistem da busca.
As a geologist, I would not expect a 5,000-year-old wooden structure to be intact up on Mount Ararat. But the fact is, hundreds of people claim they've seen it. So it seems like something is up there that fits the general shape and dimensions of the Ark as given in Scripture. And so it encourages us to continue our search. Something is up there.
I'm not going to categorically state there's no boat on the top of Mount Ararat. What I'm telling you is the whole flood story, none of it scans. There's no evidence for any of it, no data that backs it up.
We feel like if the Ark has been preserved, okay, it's been preserved for a reason, because it takes special conditions to petrify it and keep it all this time and to re-expose it. And so we think it would have special scientific and spiritual significance. So we're hoping that we can play a role in helping uncover the mystery. And if there is something there, hopefully be a direct part of it.
This again is fantastically wishful thinking. All it does is cause people to pour a lot of money into pseudo-archaeological research when they could be putting the money into something that would deal with reality.
Well, I think a Noah's Ark could have existed.
It just seems a little far-fetched for me to believe.
I don't think it's a legend at all. I think it is real.
But I don't know if it could have withstood all of these years.
I had heard that they had found an old ship up in the mountains in Turkey.
Maybe so, maybe no. They would have to show me.
Lago Ness, Escócia. Há milhões de anos, geleiras segmentaram profundamente o leito de rocha do lago escocês. A era do gelo deixou para trás um enorme e misterioso mar interior. Durante séculos, essas águas sombrias produziram lendas de uma criatura misteriosa. Tema de mais de 10.000 relatos de avistamentos originais, o monstro do Lago Ness.
It's not a static monster. It's not one monster. It's not something that is only in this incredible lake.
Lauren Coleman passou 30 anos estudando o Lago Ness. Sua pesquisa o levou a concluir que o lago não contém apenas uma fera, mas várias.
For probably over 500 years, we've had reports from that area, from the whole area of northern Scotland, of lake monsters. The interesting thing about the Loch Ness Monster is it's not just one monster, that's a myth.
Coleman diz que o número de avistamentos relatados prova sua teoria e sugere outra coisa.
We know it's a breeding population of animals because there are multiple sightings of these things in the lake. I mean, you have not just one monster that keeps showing up. You oftentimes have reports of a monster and two little monsters, for instance. You get many similarities between some of these reports, as if they may be moving around or they may be interbreeding in a way that is really beyond what a lot of people want to consider.
Os céticos argumentam que os testemunhos múltiplos demonstram como as evidências são falsas.
Well, it's important to realize that the sightings around Loch Ness are not all of one kind. Different people see different sightings at different times, and most likely there's not just one explanation for all the sightings. They have large sturgeon. They have up to 500-pound sturgeon that are going through there. There's eels in there. There's otters. There's all sorts of logs. There's lots of things that are floating in the lake.
Most of the people that are seeing and reporting these monsters in Loch Ness are locals. They know the loch. They know the wildlife that's there. Here you have a shoreline that's very close, so, you know, most people know when they're looking at an otter.
No passado, a visão de grandes animais marinhos levava os humanos a pensar que estavam vendo monstros. Encontros com baleias, grandes tubarões e lulas gigantes viraram lendas marinhas.
A lot of people are under the impression that sightings at Loch Ness go back hundreds of years and that there's really a monster tradition there. In fact, there's not. The first sightings occurred right around 1933.
O escritor Michael Dennett acha que aqueles que acreditam em monstros marinhos são vítimas de autossugestão.
They're found throughout the world, and they seem to be in proximity to humans and in relationship to humans. And I think that because of the many locations of these sea serpents, that they are a product of the human imagination.
A lot of the people who are around Loch Ness know of the monster tradition. They know that there's supposed to be something in there. And so what happens is you have the expectation that you may see something. And if you're looking for something old, you tell your friend, see if you see anything strange in the water. Well, if you're expecting to see something strange in the water, then there's a good likelihood you will.
Há grupo disposto a pôr à prova os desafios dos céticos. A Academia de Ciência Aplicada estuda o Lago Ness há décadas. Usando videografia sonar e submarina, a Academia espera provar que Nessie é real.
We're just looking for the evidence to go and track these things and try to find out and establish what exactly this enigma is, what exactly this mystery that has been looming over Loch Ness for thousands of years now.
Justice Rhines, cujos pais são pesquisadores, cresceu nas margens do lago. Ele diz que ele e seus pais viram o monstro com os próprios olhos.
And at a range of about, I would say, maybe a mile, we saw something making a wake. And we looked through and we saw two appendages, swan neck-like appendages, swimming side by side. Seeing with your own eyes changes everything. That confirmed to me that there's definitely something there.
Hoje, Justice e o pai, Dr. Robert Rhines, estão no lago. Eles usam um radar submarino do tipo SHIRP. Rebocado por barco, o sonar SHIRP usa ondas sonoras para descrever com detalhes o que há abaixo da superfície.
The idea is to go up and down the loch with this towfish, which is emitting sound waves out to the sides and then echoing back. So once you've established where the walls of the loch are, going up and down the loch, should anything appear, between that towfish and the lock is going to show up on the sonar track. And then we will hopefully be able to turn the vessel and track and record.
Expandindo o campo do sonar como uma rede acústica, os Rhines esperam documentar formas e movimentos irregulares, tais como os que uma grande criatura submarina poderia provocar.
Typically what you come up with after doing all these tests, the side scan sonars and the infrareds and the miniature submarines and all these other things, is you come up with readings that at best are ambiguous.
Os céticos dizem que seja o que for que apareça nas telas do radar, estará totalmente aberto a interpretações.
The problem I see with this approach is that at best I think we're going to have subjective data because of the data being ambiguous. People who want to see a creature will see a creature, and those who are skeptical won't see one. And so I think that they're not going to yield positive scientific results.
For a lot of the sonar reports, we're getting, we know that there's fish in Loch Ness. And the sonar people are saying that they're seeing little blips of larger animals on their scopes and also, through the graphs and different things.
Os Rhines usam outra ferramenta que é ao mesmo tempo antiga e nova: a fotografia. Eles instalaram câmeras de vídeo no fundo do lago com sensores para registrar qualquer coisa que passe.
If something were to come into that zone, we think we'd get fairly good definition. But our main goal is actually a silhouette.
And yet they've come back with almost nothing. At one point they even strapped cameras onto dolphins and had them run through the lake, and they didn't find anything at all. If they're photographed, they show bubbles or some sort of faint image somewhere, or if they're other types of scanning, they show like a blip or some somewhat slightly anomalous signature.
Até o momento, as gravações de Rhines mostram apenas um mergulhador e cardumes. Esses poucos resultados fazem os céticos indagar por que pesquisadores como os Rhines insistem.
You've looked at this thing for almost 3/4 of a century, and what have you found? Nothing. You have photos that could be of anything. You have sonar images that could be of anything. At some point, it would seem to me that you might just sort of pack it up and give up.
But in general, you don't have bodies, you don't have bones, and you don't have tracks on land. The sightings have been pretty interesting, but so far they're just sightings. We need something a little more.
The bottom line is that there's something that's creating this stir. There's been something that's been repeatedly drawing people's attention. There is something there. And it's like, why do people climb Mount Everest? Because it's there.
I think the scientific community finds topics like the Loch Ness Monster just as fascinating as many other people do. But all the data that we have suggests that these are products of folklore.
The Loch Ness Monster animals are very elusive. We don't have good evidence. We do not have any bodies yet. We have no DNA samples. We have no footprints. So I, as a cryptozoologist, know that we have to have solid evidence, and I agree with the skeptics in that realm. Until we have some solid, firm DNA of these creatures, we have to say we don't know. But there's something big out there in the loch. We need to keep investigating.
How about Loch Ness? Oh, Nessie.
I think ancient animals could have survived in lakes such as Loch Ness.
If alligators could survive, the Loch Ness could survive.
Almost proved there is no such thing as Loch Ness.
There has been too many weird sightings that we just can't explain with normal creatures.
A história de Atlântida povoa a imaginação. Uma ilha-continente, berço de uma cultura avançada, rica, poderosa e condenada. Segundo textos antigos, Atlântida abrigava a sociedade perfeita e o mar violento a devorou. Esta imagem majestosa e serena reflete o melhor e o pior da aspiração humana.
The whole notion of Atlantis has to do with how we perceive the past. It has to do with civilization, who we are, where we've been, where we're coming from, where we're going.
O escritor e explorador David Childress começou a busca de Atlântida há décadas.
The origin of the Atlantis story, as we know today, came from the ancient Egyptians. And it's a story that was given to the Greek statesman Solon by Egyptian priests about around 300 BC at a temple in Sais, Egypt, in the Nile Delta. And they told him there was a civilization over 10,000 years before them, going back to 10,000 BC. They say the name of this civilization was Atlantis.
A história aconteceu com o filósofo grego Platão. Ele teceu a lenda de Atlântida em uma série de escritos a qual chamou de Diálogos. Este foi o primeiro relato escrito de Atlântida.
The first mention of Atlantis is in two of Plato's dialogues. One is called the Timaeus, and the other is the Critias. They're a couple of the last dialogues that Plato wrote. And in there, a character named Critias gives an account of a kingdom called Atlantis. It was a powerful civilization that was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which are also known as the Straits of Gibraltar, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's a story, it's a fable that he uses to kind of develop his theory of politics and culture. He's trying to cast the ideal society.
The people were very advanced. They had metallurgy. They had a huge city, capital city on this island with concentric canals and moats and land. They had huge ships and a massive fleet. They were great navigators. And they went all over the world.
Segundo Platão, essa sociedade dominava o Oceano Atlântico. Mas no mar Mediterrâneo, um adversário menor conseguiu derrotá-la. Segundo a história, o povo de Atlântida perdeu uma guerra para os ancestrais dos gregos, porque a nação insular havia ficado orgulhosa demais. Logo depois, os deuses se enfureceram. Num dia e noite de cataclismo, todo o continente de Atlântida desapareceu debaixo das ondas. É uma história cativante, mas seria verdadeira? Os céticos classificam a história de Atlântida na categoria de ficção. O cientista alega que Platão criou a história para seu professor Sócrates.
The story of Atlantis turns out to be an assignment that Socrates gave his students. Take that perfect society we spoke about in the hypothetical yesterday, engage it in a suitable war. Make up a story in which that perfect society shows why it's perfect. Atlantis is the plot device. Atlantis, in fact, is the evil empire that threatens the perfect society, and in the perfect society in Plato's dialogues is Athens. When I started class talking about Atlantis, I say, listen to this story. Long, long time ago, very far away, an evil empire bent on domination of its known universe was stopped in it. The only thing standing in its way from the domination of its entire universe was one society. Smaller, technologically not as sophisticated, materially not as wealthy, militarily not as powerful, but they had something going for them. They had a perfect society. They were good, they were honest, they were ethical. And when I tell kids that story and I say, what story have I just told you? To a person, they say, well, that's Star Wars. And I say, exactly right. Only this version of Star Wars was written down in 350 BC. Plato's story of Atlantis is Star Wars.
Certos de que Atlântida está aí em algum lugar, Childress e aliados destacam as provas concretas históricas de outras sociedades destruídas por tremendas reviravoltas.
The history of the world is one of invasion and counter-invasion, climatic change, devastating earthquakes and tidal waves. After each of these cataclysmic events, a new civilization is created and the world comes forth again. This is much the same story of Atlantis, a story of worlds before our own, of civilizations before our own, going back 20,000 years, maybe more.
Aventureiros e arqueólogos situam a Atlântida em cada canto do globo. Desde a ilha de Terra, no Mediterrâneo, até as ruínas de Troia, onde fica agora a Turquia, aos planaltos da Bolívia, assim como na Antártida e no Caribe. Ninguém encontrou evidências de que a Atlântida ficava no meio do Oceano Atlântico, alimentando a desconfiança dos céticos em relação à teoria.
You have to go back to the actual text and go back to the claim itself. And the claim is that it was a civilization out in the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't in Antarctica, it wasn't in Troy, it wasn't in Bolivia. The place to look, if anywhere, to verify this claim is right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Descobertas de outras cidades perdidas inspiraram defensores a manter a busca de Atlântida.
It's a known archaeological fact that there are over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean alone. Over 200. They were built underwater. This is the kind of thing that people who believe in Atlantis are looking for.
A falta de provas concretas, escritos e artefatos não desencorajou os que acreditam em Atlântida. Eles creem que, com o avanço da tecnologia de exploração das profundezas marinhas, surgirão dados que revelarão pistas sobre essa sociedade antiga.
If archaeologists can ever prove that civilization, particularly around the Atlantic, is over 10,000 years old, then we will have found evidence for Atlantis. The search for Atlantis is the search for civilization.
In this day and age, with the kind of surveying that's been done on the ocean floor, I mean, we have a pretty complete picture of the structure of the ocean floor, its terrain, its topography. It's safe to say that there is no remnant of a sunken continent in the Atlantic, or really anywhere else for that matter. At least not anything in the time frame of the human experience. There was no gigantic island in the middle of anywhere that just suddenly sunk 1,000 feet. It's just not the case.
We're starved and thirsty for information about these lost civilizations like Atlantis. What we can do is try to search the world, follow up on theories and suggestions that we receive, and try to find hard physical evidence of man-made structures, of submerged terrestrial archaeological sites.
There's some theory that the volcanic activity and the earthquakes that ensued caused tsunamis which devastated the northern shore of the island of Crete. What happened was that the Egyptian priests, or the translation of the Egyptian text by the Greeks, in that translation they got it wrong by a factor of 10, and it wasn't really 9,000 years before Solon's time. It was 900 years, which would match it closely to that 1500 BC disaster.
Well, maybe in 100 years, our museums will be filled with artifacts from Atlantis. And books written by people who are skeptical about Atlantis will have to come out with new editions saying, whoops, you were right, we were wrong. But it takes evidence to do that, and the evidence just isn't there.
I think there's some truth to the lost city of Atlantis.
People are probably making it up to be something that they want it to be.
I believe that's another legend. They would have to prove it to me.
There's always a possibility with the earth shifting, land rises and falls.
There's bound to be ruins there. There's bound to be proof. We just have to find it.
The search for Atlantis goes on. Perhaps someday, on the ocean's floor or a mountaintop, the proof will turn up. For me, Atlantis remains a myth, along with Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and Noah's Ark. Believers' passionate claims for these stories trip over the requirements for proof. If these tales are to evolve from fiction to fact, logic demands evidence. We'll be back soon with a scientific perspective on extraordinary phenomena. For The Critical Eye, I'm William B. Davis.
Versão brasileira Audiocorp.
Hoje, em O Segredo das Coisas, asfalto para pavimentação. Biscoitos de marshmallow. Alto-falantes. E fechaduras eletrônicas. O asfalto é uma substância líquida negra que é um subproduto do processamento do petróleo bruto. O asfalto é um componente-chave de materiais de impermeabilização, isolamento e fabricação de telhas. Mas seu uso mais conhecido é para pavimentar estradas. O cimento asfáltico é um subproduto do petróleo bruto. O ingrediente-chave que eles combinam com pedras trituradas e outros minerais para fazer asfalto para pavimentação. Então, a produção começa na pedreira da usina de asfalto, onde uns 15 metros abaixo da terra, operários manejando máquinas pesadas coletam rochas de granito que foram removidas das paredes com explosivos. Caminhões transportam as pedras para a usina de asfalto, que fica bem no terreno da pedreira. Eles jogam sua carga no triturador principal, uma máquina cujas mandíbulas de aço trituram essas pedras gigantes em pedaços com menos de 20 centímetros. É preciso uma força colossal para triturar rocha sólida. Os volantes que amplificam a energia do motor pesam mais de 6 toneladas. O triturador principal despeja as pedras em uma esteira transportadora móvel que leva as pedras trituradas para uma área de armazenamento externa. Quando chega a hora de fazer asfalto, as pedras viajam através da esteira da área de armazenamento para um prédio de triagem para serem classificadas por tamanho. Lá, as pedras são passadas por cima de uma série de peneiras inclinadas cujos orifícios maiores têm 10 centímetros de largura. O que é grande demais para ser peneirado vai para um triturador secundário, que reduz as pedras para 10 centímetros ou menos, depois as envia para um terceiro triturador, que as reduz ainda mais para 2,5 centímetros ou menos. O que é pequeno o suficiente para passar pelas peneiras é desviado do triturador secundário e vai diretamente para o triturador terciário. Após esse último estágio de trituração, as pedras maiores possuem 2,5 centímetros de tamanho. Tudo que for menor que 60 milímetros vai para uma pilha. Isso inclui o pó de pedra criado durante o processo de trituração. As pedras que têm de 120 a 190 milímetros seguem para outra pilha. Pedras de 60 a 120 milímetros para outra. Os caminhões transferem o material de cada pilha para compartimentos separados, chamados de caixas de alimentação. Exatamente o que entra no asfalto para a pavimentação depende do que está sendo pavimentado, mas em geral há 4 ingredientes: areia, pó de pedra, pedras de 60 a 120 milímetros e de 120 a 190 milímetros. As proporções dos ingredientes variam de acordo com a utilização que será feita do asfalto para a pavimentação. Pedras, juntamente com areia e pó de pedra como enchimento, compõem em geral uns 95% da mistura. O restante, acrescentado depois, será cimento asfáltico líquido. Cada caixa libera uma quantidade específica de material para uma esteira transportadora que corre embaixo dela. As esteiras levam a uma esteira coletora principal que joga os ingredientes combinados em outra esteira que leva a uma secadora. O processo de secagem, que leva aproximadamente 1 minuto, remove qualquer traço de umidade. Isso vai permitir que os materiais